All right. This is an interview for Director of Second Edition with Mike Shea, who is the prefect on the forums. My name is Charlie. I'm the chair of the selection committee, and with me as part of the selection committee are Jonathan and Amber. We'll be hearing from them as we go. However, this call is being recorded, and Mike has consented to this being posted to the public. So before we begin, I do need everyone on the call to verbally consent to that. I'll go first. I do consent.
I consent.
Mike. Jonathan, thank you. Michael?
I do consent.
And Amber?
Yes, I consent.
All right, thank you. So we're going to interview you for the Director of Second Edition position. I'm not going to make this too formal. We're just going to hit you with some questions. Jonathan, Amber, feel free to jump in at any time. If I'm plowing forward and you want to say something, just cut me off and I'll be quiet. Try to make sure to give you guys floor time. So Mike, just so you know where we're at, as of today, we've had 3 applications. You are the second interview that we're doing. Applications are open through Friday, so we may get some number more applications. We will be posting these interviews all together when they're all done, to avoid giving anybody a preview of what anybody else is saying and to avoid any accusations of favoritism. So until such time that all these interviews are public, I ask you to not discuss what we talk about during this interview outside on the public boards, or really with anyone. But
Understood.
I don't think your husband is going to care too much.
He's not even in the room. No, even if he were, he wouldn't care. I've tried to get him to play trick and it's just not his thing. So
yep. So we're gonna try to keep this to the 60 to 90 minute range. I'm not gonna let it go past an hour and a half. So, and then I'll give you an opportunity at the end to ask any questions you might have of us or the process. But yeah, so we're gonna record these. We'll post them for public comment. That's the only thing different that we're doing from the initial article that I posted is we're posting all of the interviews for a section where the public can interact and talk and ask questions, and all the selection panel can read that and take that in before we go into voting. So otherwise we're going to follow that process in the original posting. So
right.
Let's jump into it. Thank you for your application. I thought it was really a good read. I'm going to go straight to probably the question that the most number of people who aren't here wanted to have answered. And it has to do with the time commitment involved in this. So the question is, per the article announcing your departure as Chief Ambassador, you resigned due to real world commitments that would leave you too little time in your schedule to do your job effectively. You were finishing up your PhD, you're teaching more and spending the first quarter in Taipei. You are hoping to still contribute where you can. Those are quotes from your article.
Mm-hmm.
So you were asked about it and you had an answer, but can you tell us more about what's changed between saying I'm stepping down from a job because I don't have time to it to I want an arguably more time-intensive job?
Sure. Thank you for asking the question. I think that's a very fair question to ask. So what this really comes down to is time management in the first respect. My reasons for wanting to step back, first from the post of Chief Ambassador, and then my plan slowly was to transition away from most of my volunteer duties in 2020 to make time for other priorities. Didn't have so much to do with necessarily a complete inability to juggle these different commitments. I've been a grad student with a job outside of grad school ever since I started my master's degree. As a bachelor's student, as an undergrad, a non-traditional undergrad, I had to return to school and pay my way through school which required me to work a full-time job at night and go to school during the day, in addition to participating in various extracurricular activities so that I could beef up my CV and try to get into grad school. So I'm no stranger to juggling multiple commitments. Originally, my intention was to step back from most of my volunteer commitments to second edition so that I could just begin making priorities for other things. Essentially, I felt like I had done about as much good as I could do as chief ambassador. And so I felt like the time was right for me to step back given these other obligations that I had. And in the weeks after Ross's announcement that he was stepping down, I began to realize that I have what it takes to be a great director of second edition. I also began to realize that second edition as a brand is at what I believe is a critical juncture, and that decisions made by the incoming director of second edition may well have an effect on the lifespan of the game. And so I started discussing this with players and volunteers. And the more I discussed it, the more I came to believe I'd be a good fit for the job. And so then the question just became for me about whether or not I was willing to juggle the time, whether or not I was willing to make time for this new commitment, potentially. And I think what really cinched it for me was twofold. First, that I love the game. Second edition has brought me a lot of enjoyment over the years. I love the material that the game is based on. I've been a fan of Star Trek for as long as I can remember. Certainly since The Next Generation started airing. I can remember even before that going to see the movies as a kid with my parents, and it was a big event for us. So I love the game. And since I was lucky enough to start volunteering, this game really, and my volunteer duties really became the one creative outlet I was willing and able to make time for as a grad student. If you've ever been in grad school or been in any sort of a high pressure situation like that, where you're under a lot of stress constantly and you're constantly being told by other people that you don't measure up, or you're being made to think you don't measure up anyway. One needs a creative outlet. One needs a way to step into a different world, to step into something that they enjoy, and to decompress. And for me, second edition has been that. And my volunteer duties for second edition has been that. And so because I feel like second edition is at such a critical juncture, and because I genuinely believe that I would be an excellent fit for the position, I had to decide whether I was willing to devote the time necessary to take on this new role, or whether I was willing to sort of trust in fate and let somebody else take the position and hope that they made the best decisions for the game. And like I said, I talked about it with other players. I talked about it with some friends, and ultimately I kept coming back to the old maxim that, the decisions are made by those that show up. And if I feel like the decisions that are going to be made over the next 6 months to a year for second edition are of crucial importance, and I feel like I have the capability to make good decisions under these circumstances, and I have the ability to manage time effectively, that I really needed to step up. And so it simply became it became a question of deciding whether or not I was willing to devote the time that would be necessary. And I am, and I honestly believe that I can. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, I think that's a good answer. Did anyone, Amber or Jonathan, you want to follow up on that, or should we move to another question?
I'm good with moving on.
I concur. Yep.
Okay. I'm going to go to what was probably the second most asked question by the people who aren't here. And it's sort of about the blow up that happened with John in December. I'm going to be a little light on details because this video is going to go out to the public, but here's essentially what happened is John Corbett posted something in December that you didn't agree with, and that turned into a long, I think it was 14 pages last time I checked, back and forth. Not really looking to get into the merits, but you made some strong accusations there, and you made a lot of comments that are controversial, just to some. Not trying to make judgments here.
Just to fill in a couple of points of context, this was on the 2E staff forum where this thread
Yes.
took place.
Thank you.
And John's proposal was almost universally criticized. It got no traction, didn't go anywhere.
Yes, that is the case. Yes. So these are questions that another member of the panel has posted, and several other panelists wanted to hear answered.
It's fair.
Do you feel that in hindsight you handled that situation appropriately?
That's a good question. So I think the answer is appropriate to give on a few different levels. And I'll begin by saying, I don't think this is the proper venue for me to grind any axes that I may have or to badmouth anybody involved in any way. And so I'm not going to go into a lot of details. I don't think this is the time or the place for that. I will also say that despite any personal problems or disagreements that John and I may or may not still have, we have continued to work constructively together on the testing forums. As a matter of fact, the set that's hopefully wrapping up production very soon, which will be set 50 for 2E, all through the time where John and I were having this rather heated discussion on the staff forums, over on the testing forums, we were able to maintain decorum and professionalism for the most part and continue to work together. And his testing feedback continued to be incorporated. So first of all, I just want to say that I do try to make an effort to separate the role of volunteer and the duties that come along with that, and then any sort of personal issues that may be happening. Now, did I handle myself well? Am I happy with the way things turned out? Well, I'm never happy when there's conflict. People that don't know me may have gotten the impression from my post, unfortunately, that I'm someone who relishes conflict or that I enjoy it. I absolutely hate it. It makes me uncomfortable to have to confront people or to be put in a position where I feel like I have to confront people. So it's not something I go looking for, and it's not something I relish. I had problems with the merits of John's proposal, but I also had problems with what I perceived to be the motivation or the intent. And the second part of the issue was what drew most of my criticism and most of my anger. I do feel that anger to what I perceived to be those particular set of motivations was an appropriate reaction, particularly given that this was all taking place on the staff forum away from public view. I think it would have been an entirely different scenario had this been happening on the public 2E forums. I think that even we as volunteers have to have for lack of a better term, a safe space where we can go and where we can hash out these conflicts when they occur. Because let's face it, if we're willing to donate our time and our energy and often our money and resources to keep alive what is essentially a dead game, dealing with subject matter that we all love, sometimes passionate emotions are going to get stirred up. Sometimes personality conflicts are going to occur. That's the nature of just human interaction in any creative endeavor. And so first, to contextualize, one of the reasons why I reacted the way I did was because I knew I was reacting in a relatively private space away from most players. And that's important to remember. Should I have been a little more careful in the way I treated the assignment of motive? Maybe. I think that's probably a fair criticism. I think that at least at the beginning of the conversation, I let my emotions get the better of me for a little while. And part of that was because I was so shocked by the proposal. Not just on its merits, but given the history of positive collaboration that John and I had had over the course of several years. And so I don't apologize for standing up for myself. I don't apologize for standing up for the work of other volunteers. I don't apologize for reacting strongly when I felt like the efforts of other volunteers weren't being treated fairly and weren't being given their proper respect. And I will continue to do that. I will continue to stand up for other volunteers, whether I'm director of second edition or not. But I think it would be fair to say that it's important to always remember to try to do so as diplomatically and with as much decorum as possible. And I think it would be a fair criticism to say that at least at the beginning of the conversation, I may have been lacking in that decorum to a certain degree. So that's a lesson learned, and that's something that I will carry forward. And so while I think some of my posts in their tone may have been regrettable, I don't regret standing up for what I felt like, standing up against what I felt like was an unwise proposal and an unfair proposal. And I would do the same thing again.
So you mentioned lesson learned. Were there any other lessons from this proactive discussion / situation that you would take away and move forward with?
Well, I think too, at a certain point, it's probably fair to say that one can be right and wrong at the same time. One can be right in their motives, one can be justified in their reaction, and yet at the same time still not be doing any good towards their cause. In retrospect, I think that once it became clear that on its merits, the proposal was inappropriate, unwise, and that it wasn't going anywhere, and didn't seem to have the support of other people participating in the conversation. I think once that became clear, that maybe it wasn't necessary to participate in the conversation any further. And so that's probably a good lesson to learn from that, is to know when to quit when you're ahead in a way, because you can end up giving the argument or giving the debate a life of its own well past when it really should have been resolved.
Okay, so I'm sticking on this topic. There are a number of questions here. I'm not trying to beat dead horses or grind anybody up. These are just good theoretical questions. So if John, we patch this up and move past it, and then let's say as the director in 6 months, John makes another arguably controversial proposal.
Yeah.
Would you say, I'll just read the question verbose. If that same staff member made another different proposal today, or in your tenure as TUI director, would you react the same way? And if not, how would you aim to react?
Right. So the short answer to that question is no. I wouldn't react exactly the same way, because I think reaction, or I think conversation or debate, whether it's heated or otherwise, between two relatively equally footed volunteers is one thing. The director responding to a volunteer is quite another. And I think it's entirely critical for a director to be tolerant of dissent, for a director to seek all points of view, and for a director to be cognizant of the value of dissenting points of view, and the value that those points of view can have in widening a perspective. And so there's a saying I love, and this isn't directed at John or at anybody in particular, but and I'll explain why I'm incorporating it into the conversation in a moment. But the saying is, even a broken clock gets to be right twice a day. And the idea behind that is, when someone makes a proposal to me, if I were a director, or in the past when I've been in a management position, and I have many times, as I said in my application, every staff meeting, you always get that one employee that has a history or a propensity to be the rule breaker, to be the maverick, to be the rebel, to be the guy who's going to say the inappropriate thing, or the guy who's going to question authority just as a default position. And over many years in many different management roles, I've learned to go into those conversations with the assumption, as long as they're happening in good faith, mind you, to go into those conversations with the assumption that maybe there's something to this idea. Maybe this guy's right. And so as director, it's my job, or it would be my job, to take into account all points of view. And again, that's assuming that these ideas or these controversial proposals are being made in good faith. As director, it's also part of my job to respect the work of all volunteers that are part of the production process. And that's something I feel very strongly about. I don't think that this job can be done unless volunteers feel like they're respected, and unless they feel like their work is respected, and unless they feel like they have creative permission to fail. So that means when somebody voices the unpopular idea, when somebody pushes a boundary, when somebody makes a controversial proposal or advocates for a change in direction, whatever it might be, a director has a responsibility to treat that idea with respect. Now, and evaluate it on its merits. Now, if an idea is being proposed in bad faith, or if the idea is being proposed in a way that's completely unconstructive or that's disrespectful to other volunteers on its face, that's a different matter entirely. And then I think it's a director's job to maintain some kind of decorum and discipline, and to try to deal with that volunteer privately and see if there's a more constructive way to work through the problem. But if all we're talking about here is just a controversial idea or a controversial proposal from someone who otherwise means well and who wants what's best for second edition, a director has an obligation to react very differently than another volunteer might, if that makes any sense.
I followed you there. Yeah. Okay. So just sort of riffing on that a little bit, and you touched on this, but I want to sort of have you elaborate. One of the 2E director's jobs is, building teamwork and fostering trust and effective communication. Those would be things that I think we'd all agree are essential for somebody in a director/managerial role. So this particular exchange that we've been talking about, would you say this is an example of how you would manage or lead? Or if not, how would you contrast it? Like,
so
you get where I'm heading here? Like, does that make sense?
I do. I think I do. So at the risk of repeating part of my answer, no, I wouldn't handle myself the same way as a director that I would handle myself as a simple volunteer. So John and I were having this debate essentially as two design volunteers, because John is still a volunteer in design. He's not active on any expansions right now, and that's his choice, and he's free to make that choice. But he's still a volunteer, as far as I'm aware. He's still a volunteer in good standing on design. He's still a volunteer in good standing on testing. He's still providing valuable testing feedback. I know for my project code named Lassie right now, that's finishing up, his feedback has been very valuable, and constructive. So the conversation that we were having on the staff forums was essentially between two volunteers. Now that spilled over a little bit into a personal conflict, only because that frankly the motivations I felt were behind the proposal being put forth in the first place needed to be called out. And because we were doing so in a private forum, I felt like it was, at the time anyway, I felt like it was appropriate for me to do that. And as director, I think it's important to try to avoid assigning motive, unless it's absolutely crystal clear, and often it's not. I think it's important for a director to realize that if I as a director had responded that way to John, I think I would have been sending a message to other volunteers that their dissent or that their disagreement was not welcome, whether that had been my intention or not, because I certainly wouldn't feel that way. I would always want someone who thought we were headed in the wrong direction to be comfortable telling me that. I don't think I can do, if I were to get this position, I don't think I'd be able to do my job well without that. So I would have to take great care to avoid making any other volunteer feel like their dissent or their disagreement wasn't welcome or wasn't appreciated or wasn't respected. And so I think as a director, I'd have no choice but to focus on the merits of any particular proposal. So if we're using this proposal in particular, this what John proposed in particular as an example, had I been director of TUI at the time, and had I thought it was appropriate to respond, it would have been my job to discuss the merits of the proposal. Now, if I had any personal issue with that, maybe that's something I need to take up privately with John in a completely different setting. Again, this is all hypothetical. And so I guess what I'm saying is, to reiterate, directors, and to reiterate and to maybe put it in a different way, directors don't have the luxury of getting in these kind of fights. A director has to be above that. A director has to maintain a director has to maintain a culture and a climate in which everyone's ideas are respected, and in which respect for one another and the value of teamwork and cooperation is prioritized. And so I don't have the luxury of grinding axes. I don't have the, if I'm a director, I don't have the luxury of grinding axes. I don't have the luxury of personal beefs. I don't have the luxury of vendettas. I don't have the luxury of righteous indignation, even if it's justified. I have to behave as if the privilege of engaging in that sort of debate is voluntarily put aside. Because as a director, my responsibility to be an effective manager of the entire production process from start to finish takes priority over any personal feelings I might have for anyone that I'm working with.
Okay, thank you for that answer. Amber and Jonathan, do you want to follow up at all before we move to a new topic?
I would a little bit. So first, just have you apologized to John for any of the things you said in that thread?
That's a good question. No, I have not. And he has not apologized to me. But we continue to work together constructively, as I said, in other threads, in the testing forums. We continue to work together constructively. I hope that he continues to provide constructive feedback for designers as a tester, whether I'm director or not. Over the course of the sets I've worked on where he's tested, I've found his feedback to be quite constructive in many cases. And when I worked with him as a designer, I thought that we worked well together. I'm proud of the product we produced, successes and mistakes combined. And I wouldn't be opposed to working with him again as a designer, if he was willing to do that. I think that he has good ideas as a designer. I think that his perspective is valuable there. But in terms of our personal relationship, no, we're not in a place that we've apologized to each other yet. Whether or not that happens in the future really doesn't have any bearing on how I would behave in a director-volunteer relationship with him.
Okay. One of the things you came back to a couple of times earlier was the importance that when someone makes a controversial proposal, that they're acting in good faith, that they have good intentions behind it. And I don't know, I don't know the full history of your interactions with John. I don't have access to the playtest forums. I don't know what goes on there. So maybe there was context I'm missing, but as I read the thread, it was not at all clear to me that anything John was saying, it may have been a bad idea, but it was not apparent to me that he was acting off of ill motives of any kind. And so I'm just wondering, how do you go about deciding when a proposal comes from a negative place and that it deserves this kind of fierce response that you gave it?
Sure. Okay. So, Jonathan, thank you for that question. And I want to preface this by saying it may get into a little more detail on our interactions than the general 2E public would even have access to. So to anybody watching, let me apologize for that, because some of this interaction took place on forums that most 2E players don't have access to. And as a matter of fact, as often other volunteers don't have access to. So John's proposal, and I have to sort of summarize the proposal in a nutshell in order to give it a fair answer, if that's okay. John's proposal essentially was to scrap or condense all of the work currently in any stage of pre-production or production for 2020 and essentially just start over with whomever the new director ends up being. And his stated motives for making that proposal, and he stated them in the post where he made the proposal, was that the entire creative agenda for design in 2020 had been a top-down mandate from Ross and or Maggie, and it was therefore illegitimate, that all of the decisions that were made regarding the creative agenda for design 2020 were made without the input of designers. And furthermore, that Nathan, who's the current design director, wasn't posting certain information about the design teams, perhaps because Ross and Maggie were secretly made designers, and so on and so on. So all of those were demonstrably false, frankly. And not only were all of them demonstrably false, I've felt, knowing John as I do for the last several years, that he knew that they were demonstrably false. And the reason I felt that is because he participated in the pitch process that determined the creative agenda for Design 2020. And so he was well aware that that pitch process had occurred. And when he was reminded several times that it had occurred, and when links to that exchange were posted that he would have had access to, not only did he refuse to acknowledge that he was mistaken, he continued to assert falsely that the design agenda was a top-down mandate from Ross. Now, I concluded based on that, and based on my working relationship from John in the past and my sort of assessment of what I believe he knows and what I believe he doesn't know, that the only logical explanation for that was that he was being deceptive. Furthermore, he made claims throughout the thread, for example, that he was never offered an opportunity to participate in Design 2020, that he was essentially being shut out. And again, that accusation was demonstrably false, and it was pointed out to him that it was false. He was offered a chance to work on an expansion by Nathan explicitly, and he declined. He indicated that he was interested in a side project, and I don't want to give too much away about the side project, but he indicated that he would be interested in doing a particular side project. And so Nathan's response was, well, great, pitch it, pick your team, and we'll see if we can get going. Essentially, I'm paraphrasing. And again, he declined. And this was all prior to him making that proposal. So again, the things that he was saying that he was calling on to justify having made the proposal in the first place were all demonstrably false. And they would have been, unless he had suddenly been struck with a case of significant amnesia, he would have known they were false when he made those accusations. And so I felt like concluding that he was being deceptive was a reasonable conclusion to draw based on the information that I had. And I don't apologize for making that conclusion. I still believe that to be true. But I don't know, you're correct. I don't know for sure. And so assigning motive on my part may have been unfair. And as a director, it's not something I would do because, as I said before, I don't think I would have the luxury of doing that. I would have to address it on its merits. And Nathan, to his credit as TUI design director, has been very careful to address, or was, I should say, very careful to address the proposal on its merits. I think Nathan, as director, behaved appropriately, and I would seek to behave the same way. So I hope that answers your question. It might have been a little longer of an answer than you were wanting or expecting, perhaps, but I apologize for that. I felt like it was necessary to go into that detail. If I didn't answer your question, Jonathan, please let me know.
That was good. Thank you.
Okay.
Any other follow-ups on this topic before we move on to another one? All right, excellent. So I really just want to hear, and I know you wrote about this in your application somewhat, but I'm interested in, you have identified this is a critical juncture for second edition. So I really want to know what are the two biggest factors that make that true? And how will you address them in the first 6 to 12 months of a Michael Shea administration?
Right. So thank you for that question, Charlie. I say second edition is in a critical time in its lifespan. And I say this with all respect to my predecessor. I think, or if I get the job anyway. Ross, I feel, and I think it's important to say this, Ross did his best. Ross, I've met Ross several times in person. I've interacted with him virtually on several occasions in meetings like this. And I've communicated with him on the forums, both in public, semi-public, and private messages. And so public forums, semi-public forums, and private messages. So all of my interactions with Ross would lead me to conclude that this is someone who cares a great deal about second edition, who wants the best for the game, and who takes his responsibilities as volunteer seriously. That having been said, despite his best efforts, I don't think he was a good match for the role. And I think despite his best efforts, a significant portion of the 2E community began to lose faith in second edition leadership. And so the incoming director of second edition is going to have to do a lot to restore that confidence, in addition to performing the normal duties that are associated with the role. So that means the director is going to have to go about the typical work of the production process in such a way so as to harness the efforts of volunteers across multiple departments in order to maximize quality of product while also keeping the game exciting and fun. And that's why in the, for lack of a better term, platform that I posted publicly, I focus on, or I talk about the need to focus on continuity, creativity, and quality. So the priority of the incoming director for second edition, whoever that may be, is going to have to be to restore confidence in the production process, in the overall leadership of second edition, and to restore player confidence that even if mistakes get made from time to time, and they will, let's face it, get made from time to time, that everyone involved has some kind of vision, that there's a direction they're trying to take the game, that they have the best interest of the game at heart, and that they're doing their level best to put out quality cards. And when they miss the mark, that they're doing the best to learn from those mistakes and to incorporate those lessons learned in future endeavors. And I think that those were areas where previous second edition leadership was falling short. And so I would use my time and effort as second edition director, whether I was dealing with, or whether I will be dealing with volunteers, or whether I'll be dealing with players on the public forum, to do everything I can to restore that confidence. That would be the overarching meta priority for everything else. Because,
Okay.
sorry, because I think, let's face it, without confidence in second edition leadership, the rest doesn't matter nearly as much. You can be putting out a quality product, and if people don't have confidence in your leadership and they've already decided that you're not, before they've ever seen it, that it's not going to be a quality product, then it's going to be very, very difficult to change people's minds. If they've already decided that they're not going to enjoy the product, if they've already decided that the product's not creative enough, or that it's not fun enough, or that it's not exciting enough, or that it's not balanced, if they've already made up their mind that that's what their expectations are, then it's much harder to satisfy the player base, frankly. It's much harder it's much harder to have people realize that you are, in fact, putting out a decent product, assuming that you are. And so that confidence has to be restored. And that's not to say that whether I take the job or whether it's any of the other candidates that take the job, or that get offered the job rather, won't make mistakes from time to time. I guarantee you, no matter who gets this position, mistakes will get made from time to time. But a community with confidence in second edition leadership is going to be much more forgiving of those mistakes. Whereas a community without confidence in second edition leadership is going to be much, much more likely to overlook any success.
So setting aside the actual 2E product itself,
yeah,
how do you go about restoring that confidence? Like obviously, if you're putting out cards and the cards are good, that will over time build confidence. But if there's this depression in the confidence levels, and no matter whom gets chosen as the director, there are going to be members of the community that do not like that choice. How do you go? Where do you start with such a massive task?
Right. Well, so that's a good question, and I think that there are two sides to that. There's to use restaurant terminology, there's the back of house, there's the front of house. So there's the volunteers, and then there's the players. So first, when I say first, I'm just talking about as the ideas come into my head. I'm not talking about temporally. First, you have to create an environment where volunteers are confident that their work is respected. You have to foster an environment where volunteers are comfortable enough and secure enough in their roles that they know that they have permission to fail. And when I say permission to fail, I don't mean permission to put out a bad product. I mean permission to try the new thing, permission to push the boundary, permission to think outside the box, permission to have a little fun, go a little nuts. If I can just give you a very illustrative example. My very first set that I designed on, I came up with a 2-mission set that I was just absolutely sure when testers saw this idea, they'd be blown away, and that people would go, oh my God, why haven't we ever thought of this before? It was a 0-point space mission and a 100-point planet mission, and you had to be able to solve both of them to win the game. And I thought I'd come up with something brilliant. I mean, I was certain of it. And the reaction of testers when version A of that set came out for testing was uniformly, oh, for the love of God, what are you thinking? And that was the politest response I got. And the responses ranged everywhere from that to, please, hell no, don't make this card or these cards. And John was the 2E design director then. And to his credit, he responded to the testers and he said, look, folks, be constructive. This is version A. The designers are pushing limits. They're thinking outside the box. Tone it down and be constructive. And the testers, to their credit, took that advice and gave constructive feedback as to why the cards shouldn't have been made. And I, as a fledgling designer, read that feedback and said, you know what? These cards have got to be dropped, period. They're going to be bad news for the game. And I should never have pitched them. But I was never made to feel ashamed that I'd pitched them. I was never made to feel like my job had been on the line because I pitched them. I was never made to feel like because I'd pitched them, the whole set was going to get thrown out, or that my work was going to get thrown out, or that I was going to get kicked off the design team. In other words, I was working in an environment where I felt safe and where I felt like my efforts were respected. And I hope anyway, because tester feedback was very clearly incorporated as those cards disappeared and were gone by version B, the testers felt like their feedback was being respected. And so that's essential. And so as director, I would work to make sure that volunteers understand that they have that permission to fail, that their jobs aren't going to be on the line because they post a crazy idea or make an outlandish proposal. That's number one. Number two, the volunteers have to know that their time is respected, that their ideas aren't going to get dismissed out of hand, that their efforts are going to amount to something. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that every card that's ever pitched is going to get made. Anybody that's ever worked on design or that's ever worked as a tester knows that just doesn't happen. Bad ideas get pitched. They shouldn't get made. It's part of the process. And sets ultimately get judged on the cards that get made, not the ideas that get discarded along the way. So that's important. And so as director, I would try to make absolutely sure that volunteers on all departments knew that not only did they have permission to fail, not only did they have a safe space in which to be creative, but that their time would be respected and their efforts would be respected. So that's back of the house. And also, I would make an effort to make sure that sets were being produced on a reasonable and predictable schedule. Deadlines are important. Deadlines are a big part of whether or not a community has confidence that things are going on behind the scenes in a way that's appropriate, that the production process is being managed effectively. If a playing community is forced to endure delay after delay after delay after delay, if 4 or 5 sets in a row get delayed by a month or two, and players just come to expect that, whether they realize it or not, subconsciously they're being told the production process is off kilter somehow. Appropriate management isn't happening on a consistent level. So now I know I'm transitioning from back of house to front of house because that straddles both. So now when we talk about front of house, in other words, we talk about the player community. It'll be my job to make sure players understand that we as volunteers are accountable to them. And that accountability stops with me. Ultimately, if cards get made that players don't like, and obviously along the production process, we make every effort to make sure cards that players don't like aren't getting made. But bad ideas are going to slip through. Honest mistakes are going to get made, no matter who gets this job. And so part of my responsibility as second edition director will be to be as transparent as possible with players. When a mistake gets made, how did that mistake happen? What are we doing to fix it? How are we learning from that so that that same mistake doesn't happen again? And to communicate that to the players in a timely manner and in a manner that is as clear as possible. And so that's important. So managing not just the design aspect of the production process, but where appropriate, the errata side of it, the rules side. For example, one idea I have is to strengthen the inter-team relationship or the level of communication between design, testing, errata, and rules. Because right now, oftentimes when rules gets a chance to look at cards, they might be in version C or D. Errata doesn't really start looking at cards until they're already a problem. And so I'd like for rules to be involved in the process a little earlier. I'd like for errata to be involved in the process earlier to try to help designers head off mistakes before they get made. Because let's face it, if you're on the errata team or if you're on the rules team, you're on that team probably because you have a way of thinking about cards and about interactions that designers may not have. You have a perspective that designers may lack. And so if you're a volunteer on one of those teams, your feedback may be very valuable much earlier in the process. And so I'd like to do that. Or I'd like to at least explore how we would do that and whether or not that is as good an idea as I think it is. So to sum up, I think on the one hand, you've got to do everything you can to make sure volunteers are working in a positive and constructive environment. You've got to create an environment as director that maximizes the tendency for people to work together and to collaborate. But you also have to create an environment for the 2E players that prioritizes clarity and transparency. And when mistakes do get made, to own up to those mistakes, to take ownership of them, to be as diligent as possible and as timely as possible in the reaction to those mistakes, and into seeing that appropriate steps are taken, that those mistakes don't get repeated again in future. Now that's talking about when stuff goes wrong. Other than that, normal day-to-day operations, just making sure that I'm an active part of the forums, making sure that I drop in from time to time to sort of take the pulse of the community, to communicate with the community. Like Ross, for example, sort of emulated, Charlie, what you do on the 1E side, is sort of the 1E roundup, or these weekly posts that sort of talk about the state of play for 1E, for example. And Ross did that too. He had a slightly different take on it, but he did it, and he did it every week. And I think that was a really good idea that Ross had, and I would continue to do that as well, to sort of try to communicate with players on a regular basis, let them know where the game is, let them know what's happening in the player community at large, and without giving too much away, let them know where the game is headed. And so that they can build anticipation and excitement for the ideas that are to come.
Okay, thank you. At this point, I'd like to open it up to Amber and Jonathan. If you guys have questions you'd like to ask, fire them off, because I've been talking a lot.
So. I have a couple of questions. Are there any areas that are under the director of second edition's purview where you'd say that your knowledge of how this area works is kind of weak, and you're going to need to learn more about the existing practices once you're on the job in order to lead effectively?
Oh, absolutely. As a matter of fact, as director of second edition, I'm going to go into the process, at least at first, as if I know nothing. And let me explain what I mean by that. One of my, I've been a manager for a research team at Georgia State University for the last 6 years, going into 7 years now. And we put out a country intelligence index and a data visualization tool that runs off of over 1 million points of country level data for 199 countries going back 14 years. And because it's a data visualization tool, there are a lot of moving parts, a lot of HTML coding, for example, that I don't know anything about, thankfully. Anyway, it's a complex process and a complex tool. And every summer, the team that I manage is responsible for helping to update all of the teaching materials that go along with that tool. And part of that process is beta testing our data to make sure that the data we collected that goes into updating that data visualization tool is accurate. And so every team that I've managed every summer, going back 6 years, I always tell them to start the beta testing process with the assumption that the data they're looking at is wrong, and then try to prove that it is. So if I see a data point, for example, during beta testing that gives me even a moment's doubt, oh, USA doesn't have that aggregate GDP, that's not possible. Fine. Start trying to figure out whether I'm right. Don't assume the tool is right and I'm wrong. Assume I'm right and the tool is wrong, because that's how you catch mistakes. So you have to go into beta testing with this idea that everything's broken, and then you have to prove yourself wrong. That's sort of, if I can make a rough analogy, the way I would start the process as second edition director. I'd meet with the department heads of all of the departments under the 2E production process, and I would start with the assumption that I don't know anything about what happens. And I let them tell me so what sets are currently in any phase of production, from the earliest pitch process all the way through to Johnny has these cards and they're being templated, and everywhere in between. What's happening? What's going on? Where is every card in its process? Where's the set in the process? What themes are being explored? What ideas are being explored? And how does each department come into the process? At what point do they come in? And how do they interact with each other? I'm going to assume that I don't have any of those answers. And the reason I'm going to assume that, Even though I have volunteered for design and I have volunteered for creative and I've volunteered for art, I'm going to assume there are things I don't know, which is probably true because I've never been a director for any of those departments. And I recognize that there's probably information the directors have that I as a volunteer don't. And so my job, at least at the very beginning of the process, when I'm dealing with second edition directors for the first time or when I'm dealing with team directors or department directors for the first time as their second edition director, my job is going to be to listen so that hopefully I can pick up bits of information that I don't know. And when I start to try to make decisions or try to exercise any sort of supervisory authority, it's from a more well-informed position because I've spent the first part of my job listening rather than dictating. Does that answer your question?
That's helpful. Thank you. Okay. If I might ask another question, it is an unfortunate reality that the second edition community can be fairly angry and toxic at times. And in the position of director of second edition, you will undoubtedly end up becoming the target of some people's ire. So how are you planning to deal with all of that kind of bitterness? It just sort of relates to your question about confidence before, a little bit different. And, how can you promote a better environment?
Well, that's a good question. So I'm going to answer the second part of the question first. How do I promote a better environment? Well, first of all, as I said before, when it comes to dealing with volunteers, I no longer, if I'm second edition director, I no longer have the luxury of grinding axes or of participating in feuds or vendettas or whatever. I've lost that privilege. I've voluntarily given it up. And what I get in exchange is the authority to help guide second edition and to exercise any sort of authority. That authority comes with a price. And part of that price is I give up my privilege to engage in those kind of fights. That same holds true for again, to use the restaurant analogy, front of house. That same holds true for the player community. I have had the benefit of watching now 2 consecutive 2E directors navigate this, Charlie and Ross. And with very, very few exceptions, I feel like Charlie and Ross did that well. You would have to look, I think anyway, and to the best of my recollection, you would have to look long and hard to find an example of either of those 2 engaging in a feud with a player or responding personally to a personal criticism that was made. And I think that's the right thing to do. I think that's the right way to go. So if I'm getting a lot of static from players about a particular set, let's say, and the general gist of some very vocal players on the forum, and I'm sure we can all imagine certain players in this hypothetical setting, is that I have no idea what I'm doing, and I'm a complete moron, and all of the decisions I'm making are ruining 2E forever, and the game's dying. They're going to have that opinion. And so, and they're entitled to that opinion. The best I can hope for as second edition director is to try to convince them that they're wrong, not by debating them, not by belittling them, or not by responding on a personal level to them, or by assigning motive, or doing any of those things that I might do as another player on the forums, engage in the debate on a personal level. But by trying to figure out where their concerns are coming from, what actual gameplay concerns are they articulating? What's the nature of their discomfort with the game? What's really going on behind the scenes, so to speak? And try to speak to that. So if I have players that are saying, for example, oh, 2E's dying and your decisions are terrible and you're killing the game, well, rather than respond up to those posts on a personal level and engage that way. Oh, how dare you say that? That's unfair. You're hurting my feelings or whatever. Rather than do that, my job as director will be to try to figure out what's driving that anxiety, or what's driving that anger, or what's driving that dissatisfaction, and try to address that. Maybe a player is playing in a meta where a particular deck has come to dominate, and it's a particularly nasty deck, and it's not fun to play against. Maybe my job as director is to try to figure out how we can address that deck, if it's appropriate to address it. And addressing that deck, by the way, could be anything from, okay, let me talk to some really smart players and let's see if we can do an article on how to respond to this strategy, like a sort of deck of the week or deck of the month sort of approach. That's the most benign way to deal with a problem deck, for example. And the options go forward from there all the way through to errata. Okay, there's a combination here that's clearly broken. We've got to fix it. We've got to do so sooner rather than later. And so my job as second edition director is going to be to try to address those concerns and anxieties on that level. And hopefully, if I do that job well enough and consistently enough, those kinds of criticisms start to diminish. They'll never go away completely. One thing I've learned as a volunteer in a creative endeavor over the past several years, you can't please everybody, and you're stupid if you try. All you can do is the best you can do. You try to put out a quality product that you can be proud of, that you're proud to have your name attached to. Some people are going to love it. Some people are going to hate it. All you can do is try to maximize the people who love it and minimize the people who hate it. But there's always going to be people who are unhappy. And so the way to deal with that effectively, in my opinion, is to try to figure out what it is that's making them unhappy. And if there's a way to address that root cause, then that's where my job comes in as director of second edition.
So real quick, can I ask a follow-up to that real quick, Jonathan?
Yeah, go for it.
So one could argue that the sort of negativity and toxicity is a 2E phenomenon because it really doesn't show up on 1E stuff. And I know you're mostly a 2E guy and you don't really read the Rennie forums, so just accept that supposition as true. I don't particularly want to debate the merits of it anyway. But if you accept that the negativity and this sort of rush to judgment is a 2E phenomenon, why do you think that's the case? What do you think has led the 2E forums to that place that hasn't led the 1E forums to that place?
That's a good question. And I will say, I know that this isn't the appropriate forum to debate that premise out. I have heard other people say the same thing. As a matter of fact, when I began, when I came back to the game in 2010, after an absence, one of the first things I was told in a local event was, stay off forums. Forums are a terrible place. You won't like the game if you go on the forums. Just come to the events and play the game. For a long time, that's what I did. As a matter of fact, I didn't start being active on the forums until I'd attended about my 6th or 7th tournament in a row and just got my ass handed to me over and over again. We're just losing games left and right. And I got so tired of feeling like I wasn't enjoying the game, just walking into a tournament knowing I was going to lose every game or almost every game. The game was not fun for me. I felt like it was an exercise. I felt like I was cannon fodder for somebody else, or a ratings pinata, or whatever you want to call it. And so I started going on the forums and asking questions. And my interaction on the forums was limited to sending players messages. So I would go, I figured out how to go around and look at different decks that were built. And if a deck was winning a lot of games, I would send a private message to that player. And I would say, hey, I'm new. I don't quite understand how this deck works. Can you walk me through it? most players responded very timely, in a very timely manner, and they responded very positively, and most players were very happy to walk me through. And so slowly I started getting involved in the forums, and then I started to notice that there was a certain level of combativeness or toxicity in the 2e forums that I think is regrettable. Now, part of that is addressed through, frankly, a code of conduct and effective moderation. And I know on the 2e side of the forum that those are controversial ideas, but that's part of it. But if you're asking for why I think there's such a difference in climate between second edition and first edition, I just think part of that has probably got to boil down to some of the personalities that are involved. And frankly, I don't know how you fix that. People are going to be who they are. And in an online community, you take the good with the bad. And I don't think that you can have a moderate, I mean, now, first of all, let me just say, I understand that what I'm about to say falls well outside of Director of Second Edition purview. I have, if I were to be offered this position, I have no misunderstanding about my ability to influence how the forums are moderated. That is so far outside of the job description, as far as I'm aware of it, that the answer that I'm about to give you should probably be construed as just my opinion as a player. You can't have an environment of moderation that's so strict that people start to feel like that their ability to discuss and communicate has been chilled, because that'll kill the game, or that can kill a game, I should say. But at the same time, if there are particular players that really aren't contributing anything positive, and as a matter of fact are hurting the brand and are driving players away, and I think that does happen, that can happen. I don't know if it happens often. I don't know that there's data that would prove one way or another whether it does happen often. Because frankly, unfortunately, when a player decides to no longer play, they don't often give us the benefit of telling us why they left. So, but I do think it is possible that the environment does, from time to time, drive people away. Whether that's true or not, I think that the truth remains that unfortunately the forum climate is what it is, and we as volunteers have to recognize that that's a reality, and we have to work with it. And one of the ways that I think so let me turn my answer now to a way that I think that problem can be combated. I think that tournament directors and ambassadors can do a lot to mitigate or combat that problem or that reality. For example, if I can toot my own horn, so to speak, when I took over as one of the lead tournament directors for Atlanta's playgroup, our playgroup was dying. And it was dying, frankly, because there had been a player who was dominant for so long in that playgroup, frankly, that players were losing interest. And so when I took over, when I started going to Atlanta games, I could show up and there'd be 6, 8, or 10 players reliably at any local event. And by the time this particular strong player left the playgroup, he moved. And I sort of took over as one of the tournament directors for Atlanta. We were lucky to get 4 people. In fact, sometimes we had to cancel events. And so our playgroup was dying. And one of the ways that we addressed that was I sort of pulled aside some of the remaining stronger players that were left and sort of personally said, hey, maybe don't bring your A deck to every local. Maybe don't bring the deck you would take to Worlds to the local. And to their credit, they did that. And we tried to be as friendly and as welcoming as we possibly could be at events. And we've revived the Atlanta playgroup, and we're now thriving years later. And we actually have other players from Alabama and from North Carolina come and play with us, because on the occasions they've had to meet us, they've had so much fun that it's worth it for them to drive several hours to come play with us. And it happens a few times every year. And sometimes we go play with them. And so whatever negativity might be happening on the forum, we can combat that by creating a very positive play experience on the ground. And so I think that's one way that you combat that. And as director of second edition, I recognize that I don't have a lot of ability to influence that directly, but I can influence that indirectly in the way that I communicate with players, perhaps in occasionally talking about popular decks, or recounting what happens at particular local events, trying to emphasize that players are still coming together, that players are still having a good time, that players are still enjoying this game. And as long as that message keeps getting out, combined with, as I talked about earlier, sort of a restoration of confidence in the way decisions are getting made, I think that we can get ourselves in a position where we're starting to counteract that negativity.
Okay, thank you for that. Jonathan, Amber, any other questions?
Okay, I have one.
Go ahead.
Okay, you had mentioned briefly before, different metas and possible cards and different metas. Expanding on that, we've seen a lot that, even different continents have different needs, different ways of looking at 2E. How would you start going about balancing all of those different metas, needs, and wants for the game?
That's a good question, Amber. And so the CC, based on exchanges that have happened in the period of review and in and around board meetings, particularly over the past 6 months, I think, there's sort of been a renewed focus on the need for diversity in the volunteer community. And I don't think, and that's not to imply or to suggest that valuing diversity was ever something the CC didn't do. But I think that there was a perception, either rightly or wrongly, on the part of some players that certain perspectives from certain geographies were being ignored. And so the CC, I think, to its credit, has recommitted itself to prioritizing diversity. And I think that's one way that as a 2E director, I can try to account for that reality that you so rightly point to, Amber, that there can be one play group, for example, that's very, very happy with the game as it exists right now, while another play group a quarter of the way or halfway around the world is really unhappy. So how do you reconcile that? Well, you can't start by saying one group is right and the other group is wrong, because how in the world would you ever go about proving that? You have to assume that the players are happy who are happy for a reason, and that the players who are unhappy for a reason. And you can't solve the problems of the unhappy players necessarily without taking away what's making happy players over here happy. You can't minimize the risk of that, or conversely, you keep this group of players happy and this group of players stays unhappy. The only way to mitigate the risk of doing those things, in my mind, is to try to have a diverse set of opinions represented in the volunteer community. And so as 2E director, one of the things I think I would have to do would be to try to recruit and incentivize testers from metas that aren't currently very active in the testing process, for whatever reason. To try to recruit designers from metas that aren't really well represented in the design aspect of the production process for whatever reason. And see if it's not possible to make the volunteer groups a little more diverse, so that when conversations around certain cards or around certain creative themes or around solutions to certain problems happen, that those conversations have the benefit of as many valid perspectives as possible. And again, I think it's important for me, if I get the position of director, to recognize that I'm not going to be able to please everybody, and that no product we put out is going to be able to please everybody. But if there are a diversity of opinions involved in the process, you stand a very good chance of pleasing more people than you would have otherwise. And if I can borrow a little bit from my work as a political scientist and as a comparativist, as long as everybody thinks the process is fair, and this is true in politics, and I think this is true in our creative endeavor as well, as long as everybody's reasonably assured that the process is fair, they can put up with disappointment from time to time, because they have every reason to expect that they won't be disappointed forever. And we see that in politics, right? Just in the United States, we have a two-party system, and sometimes one party is in power and the other party is not in power. The only way that people who support the party who's not in power go on living happily as Americans from day to day is because they have faith in the reality that the process is more or less fair, and that sooner or later the people they support are going to come back into power, or that their ideas are going to get attention once again. And so we sort of all hang on. Our creative endeavor in second edition is much the same way, at least from that perspective. People have to be confident in the notion that the process itself is fair. And the way that you do that, I think, from this particular perspective, is you try to make sure that their viewpoints are represented. They may not win every argument. So if meta A is unhappy and meta B is happy, and you're involved in, say, designing a particular part of the set that touches directly on that difference of opinion, maybe meta A wins that debate, maybe meta B does. So one of those metas is going to continue to be disappointed, or is going to be disappointed, right? Meta A is either going to continue to be a little unhappy, or meta B is going to be less happy than they were before. But as long as members of meta A and meta B are both reasonably certain that their viewpoints were heard and that the process was fair, I think it's much more likely that they'll hang around, that they'll accept the decision even if they're not happy with it, and that they'll hang around to see what happens next. And so that's got to be a priority as well.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, we're definitely coming up on our 90 minutes, so I'll ask, does anyone have any last questions that we can tackle? I don't want to discourage anyone from asking a question, but just want everybody to be aware of the time. Okay, Mike, I'll give you a chance. Did you have any questions you wanted to ask us?
Yes, I'll just ask one question, since I know we're running short on time, and I want to thank you all for putting up with some of my answers that were a little longer. I hope I answered your questions. My question is for the volunteers. What do you want? What do you perceive to be the biggest challenges facing second edition, and what would you want out of an incoming director? Just speaking broadly.
Sure, I'll let Amber go first.
Okay. On my perspective, I think one of the biggest issues in 2E is the issue between the different metas and different global metas and perspective, as I alluded to. So I would hope to have someone who is familiar with more of the worldwide metas, maybe someone who has played a more diverse group of people. So that way those viewpoints can be balanced.
Jonathan, did you want to answer?
I suppose my biggest concerns have to do with the health of the community and the negativity that I asked about earlier. And that's where I feel like there's the most need for work.
Yeah, I'd say that, my answer, I'm going into this, and I was very clear about this. My priority is identifying the skill set in the candidates that is necessary to do a director job. As the only person on the panel that's done that in the CC world. So really that's it. I mean, I'm looking for management skills and leadership skills, communication skills, political skills, and diplomatic skills, because those are really the 5 aspects that you have to be a director. And so those are going to be the priorities that I'm looking for in the candidates.
Thank you all for that answer. Would it be appropriate for me just to make a very brief sort of closing that tries to address those in just a very general way?
I didn't really let the previous candidate do such a thing, so I think for fairness, I will decline that.
Okay.
But
Well,
I appreciate the thought.
No, then I will say thank you all for your answers, and I've been taking notes.
Well, so what will happen, just so you know, is we may reach out to you with follow-up questions in text, and those will go on the record too. So if somebody who isn't here wants a particular question followed up, they'll post it, I'll post it to you, and then I'll return your answer back. And then once these videos go live, you may have the same situation where public people will post and ask questions and follow up. So, and since we're short on time, I don't want you to feel like you didn't have the opportunity to ask process questions. So if you have any questions about the process and the timeline, you could reach out to me and I'll answer those for you too.
Okay.
But essentially the process is exactly as we outlined earlier, with the addition of the public comment period step.
I think I was pretty clear on that.
Yeah, the position applications are open through Friday. As of right now, I have 3. That may change, and then once all the interviews are completed, we'll post the interviews. We'll reach out to everyone before making a decision, yes or no. You won't find out you didn't get it by going to the website. You'll know before that you didn't get it or you did. So I want to thank you, Michael, for being here, and Amber and Jonathan for being here as well. And I'm going to go ahead and stop the YouTube video.